Hi there, it's Professor Malat. This week we're going to be talking about narrative. So I've asked the question here, what is narrative? You may have seen that the first essay that you have to write for this class is a literacy narrative. But what is narrative? Well, narrative is from the Latin word narrare or narro, which means to tell or I tell. So, by extension, there, narration is simply the act of storytelling. And as we've learned from Andrew Stanton's video, storytelling or narration makes a promise to the audience. It makes a promise to the reader or the viewer or the listener. Um, so you've read a personal literacy narrative from Malcolm X, and now I'm asking you to take what you've learned through that reading and through the video that Andrew Stanton presented in his TED Talk. I want you to write your own literacy narrative. But we're going to talk today a little bit about what we call narrative conventions. And these are things that writers use when they're creating a story, and they make sure that the story can be understood and visualized and enjoyed by the audience. They include these six things, but I'm only going to go into detail of the first four. We have character, setting, point of view, plot, theme, and style. So let's take a look at character first. Um, of course, the character in a personal narrative is going to be yourself. You are the narrator, you are the storyteller, and you are the main character in your own story. But we have different types of characters when it comes to the different stories that are being told. We have the protagonist, as I said, that's the main character. That is the person who faces the main conflict, the main problem, the challenge that needs to be overcome. Somebody who develops strengths or learns lessons. Then there is the antagonist, and that is usually any character who creates opposition for the protagonist, for the main character. We also have supporting characters as well as minor characters. So, how do all of these things come into play when we are writing a non fictional personal narrative? Well, again, you will be the protagonist, right? You are the main character in the story. Depending on what you want to focus on in your literacy narrative, there may be an antagonist, right? Um, they may be, you may have had a teacher or a another student or somebody in your life who really created opposition for you, especially in your literacy journey. And we'll talk more about that. So when it comes to constructing characters, you want to think about the things that they say. You want to, how does this person speak? Of course, this is you, so you know your own thoughts. You know how you're going to say things. How do they look? You don't really need to go into that great a detail. Actions, things that they do or how they behave, and how other characters relate to or feel about them. So when you are primarily writing a personal narrative, and this is the next slide. When you're writing a personal narrative, it's important to remember that you are the main character in your own story. Again, depending on the story, there might be an antagonist. You also want to make sure that you present yourself with honesty, exposing your flaws and challenges to the audience. And as the protagonist develops, the reader learns about conflict resolution. I do want to take a moment just to talk about literacy here so that you understand what I mean about literacy. For this first essay, which is the literacy narrative, it's a story of your development as a reader and a writer, right? So you'll primarily be using first person point of view, which means you will use pronouns I, me, and mine. Um, we do have first person plural, which is we and our, um, but you probably won't be using that. This might seem unusual to you if you have been told in the past to never use first person in your writing. So I want you to think about something from your past that's contributed to how you've developed as a literate person. So we have literacy narrative is a story of your own development as a literate person. So next, let's move on to setting. Now, of course, all stories include some kind of setting, and setting is something that includes the time, the place, the atmosphere, or mood that's created in the narrative. It's where things take place, right? And setting relies heavily on descriptive language and connotation, the ideas and feelings associated with particular words when analyzing setting. You need to consider things like time, the time of day or the time of year or the time in your life that this certain event may have happened, right? You may be focusing on the first time you went to school. It really depends on what you're doing in the story, right? You also want to talk about place, right? It might be a room, a building, a town, state, country, where that story is taking place. So you want to think about the associations of those places. Indoor versus outdoor, rural versus urban, beaches, school, mountains, so on and so forth. Atmosphere probably won't come into play as much because we are writing something non-fictional. But if you write a fictional narrative, mood and atmosphere are created through particular word choices, descriptive language, and structural features. So ways that you can convey setting. Again, you can talk about specific dates or however how old you were at the particular time you want to talk about. Direct mention of times, time of day might not come into play. Mention of specific places, you might talk about your bedroom or a classroom or whatever feels relevant for your story. Clues about historical eras probably won't come into play unless you happen to be an older student and you want to talk about growing up in the 80s or the 90s versus those of you who are born after the year 2000. Um, and description of fictional locations, of course, will not come into play because you are writing a non-fictional narrative. So let's move on. Let me see. Anything else that I want you to remember? Settings are described to help engage the reader's five senses. So when you think about a setting, you want to use descriptive writing so that setting comes alive in the mind of your audience, right? So look at how weather contributes to the mood of the setting or the emotions of the character. Well, that's really more for fictional writing. Look for big places like towns or countries and small places like rooms. And make sure that the setting is relevant, again, to your story of your particular literacy journey. Move on. We'll talk about point of view. I already brought this up when it was relating to character. We will be focusing primarily on first person point of view, but point of view establishes the distance between the reader and the characters in the story. So it helps to give a little bit of perspective. And there are four main points of view. We will focus primarily on first person: I, me, my, mine, we, our, ours. Second person, you might have to come in and use second person, especially if you want to write about the thoughts of some other character who is in your story, or what they may have said. So you'll use no, not second person, I'm sorry. You'll use third person. Second person, we won't be using. It's kind of unusual to use second person, but third person, yes. They, them, their, his, hers, he, she. Um, we won't talk much about limited and omniscient. If this were a creative writing class, we would get deeper into those things, but we really don't need to talk too much about limited, third person limited, and third person omniscient because it really doesn't come into play for your non fictional narrative. Again, first person point of view is usually the protagonist, the narrator of the story, but it can sometimes be another character. Again, because we are focusing on your own journey, it will be you. So first person presents the events from the perspective of one character and privileges their viewpoint over others. So of course you're telling your own story. You want to privilege your own perspective over that of another. The narrator is an eyewitness to the events, making the audience feel as if they are there. It personalizes the story, brings the reader closer to the character, and the narrator cannot know everything about the other characters and can only really know his or her own mind. Again, we will not be using second person, but for third person point of view, um, the reader can receive a lot of information about all the characters and their thoughts and feelings. And the reader can also come to understand multiple viewpoints. So it's really up to you whether or not you feel you can use third person in your narrative, but primarily you will be focusing on first person. Next comes plot. So the whole point of telling a story is to get your reader engaged, to understand what your journey has been like, and to sympathize with you. So you have to have some kind of a plot, some kind of um, a semblance of something happening where you had a transitional moment, maybe an aha moment, right? And um, there comes some kind of resolution. So we have a sequence of events, and the organization of these elements generate interest and sometimes suspense and surprise for the reader as well. You know, there might be an unexpected twist to your own literacy journey that I was not expecting, right? So the plot of your narrative usually follows the basic structure. We have exposition, which is kind of introductory stuff, right? Kind of the background information, the setting of the plot, right? And then you have rising action. There is something happening that is causing conflict within the main character. Then it comes to a climax, and then a falling action, and then usually a resolution. This slide goes into greater detail. You learn background information in the exposition. We find out about setting, where the story is taking place, characters are introduced, and a conflict is usually introduced or hinted at. Then we have the rising action. As I said before, the issue begins to worsen, and these problems start to move the plot towards a climax. The climax is the peak, right? It is the highest point of tension. It could range from life or death, hopefully not with your literacy journey, but it's a pivotal moment, right? It's a tense, pivotal moment where your reader realizes who or what is going to succeed in winning the conflict, right? Then we have the falling action. Sometimes that's called denouement. And these are actions that help to unravel or solve or deal with the problem. And it leads us towards the resolution, which is the final outcome of the conflict. Um, there are various types of conflicts, and you know, if you've watched movies or you've read books, you've probably have experienced all of these. But most typically, we have person to person, person versus self. This is often something that we see in literacy narratives. A character faces an internal struggle within themselves. If you think about Malcolm X, there was an internal struggle in his whole experience learning how to read and learning how to write while he was in prison. There's also a little bit of person versus person conflict there. He's conflicted within himself, but he's also dealing with and other people. Also, person versus society, right? If we think of Malcolm X's example, a character's beliefs and desires differ from the norm, or they aren't accepted into society for one reason or another. So here's a man in prison who is trying to um, further his education and become a person who can read and write and understand and communicate, um, and fit into society and work for the greater good, right? And lastly, we have person versus environment. This is not going to be something unless you experience something really traumatic, like you lived in an area where there was an earthquake or a hurricane and you lost your home. Um, Typically, that's not going to be a conflict, a major conflict within a literacy narrative. Some other information here when looking at plot structure. You need to remember that there are common structural features in stories like foreshadowing, flashbacks, or flash forwards. If you use any of those techniques, I will be floored. I don't expect them, and I don't require them. But if you happen to use them, if you're a creative writer, go for it. That's fantastic. Readers can learn about life through character struggles and experiences. So I want to learn something, not just about you as a student or as an individual, but learn something about your struggles, right? Learn something about life. Readers enjoy experiencing the tension and suspense of stories, as well as the sense of relief when the tension is broken and there's a resolution. The exposition is usually about 1/4 of the story, and the climax usually takes place about 3/4 into the story. Don't think too hard about that. That's just generic information. Um, and it's usually through the conflict and the resolution that we identify the theme or message of the story. Of course, we're not talking about theme and we are not talking about style today. Again, if it were a creative writing class, we would delve deeper into those things, but this at least gives you a general idea of what narrative is. So now it's your turn. Learning about these narrative conventions can help you to understand and analyze a range of text types, including short stories, novels, feature films, and a whole lot more. But it can also help you to understand a lot of non-fictional essays, things that have really happened to people. But it also helps us to create our own narratives, considering the way that specific choices might help to communicate key ideas and position the audience response. Okay, so hopefully that is a little more information, tagged on top of the narrative that you've read and the video that you've watched and the handout on narration. Hopefully, this will give you some information to work with as you begin to construct and compose your own personal narrative of your literacy journey. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.